Good afternoon, good morning. Welcome to Data and AI Live, wherever you are joining us in the world. Thank you very much for logging on. Today, we're going to be talking about how to lead an AI transformation from backroom tech to boardroom strategy. And first things first, just like to welcome my guest, Richard Sargeant. Richard, thank you very much for joining us.
Thanks for having me, Jeremy.
Richard, for those who don't know, Richard is a MD and partner at Boston Consulting Group. He's former COO of Faculty, who are Europe's leading AI solutions and services business. Or consultancy, I should say. He was head of digital transformation at the UK Home Office, head of public policy for Google, as well as many other fantastic things. And we're really lucky to have him on the show today to talk about this topic. And I don't think we could be in better hands with Richard. So yeah, Richard, thanks again. How was your Easter?
It was great, thank you. We had a week in the west of Ireland in Dingle, and fantastic scenery and company. Despite the occasional stormy day we had, it was wonderful to be away.
Brilliant. Well, thanks for coming back just for Data and AI Live. It's very good of you. What we're going to, just so everyone knows, in terms of running, in terms of the format, what we're going to cover today is we're going to start by talking about why most AI transformations fail. We're then going to move on to the three waves of AI transformation that are advisable: strategy change, operating model change, and change of culture. We're then going to move on towards the end of the show, so do stay tuned for this. Rich is going to talk specifically about certain organizations that have been transformed leveraging AI, so do stay around for that. And then we'll move on to Q&A at the end. But just for everyone watching and listening, do pop your questions into the questions box at any time during the show, because we are live and we may use those questions as we go through. But if we don't, I will go through them at the end. So anytime a question pops into your head, do pop it in the questions box as we go through. Just before we start, I just want to get a gauge of everyone who's watching and listening. If you could pop into the comments box either yes, no, or soon to the question, are you currently part of an AI transformation of any kind in your business? So please pop in the comments box, yes, no, or soon, because it'd be good to get a gauge of today's audience, kind of where you are in your own company's journey on this. So yeah, are you currently part of an AI transformation? Yes, no, or soon, please, in the comments box. Right, well, let's get into it, shall we, Richard, I guess, and we're sort of, starting and throwing you right into the fire with this question. Why do most AI transformations fail?
Well, it's a great question, and despite the enormous hopes and expectations accompanying most transformation exercises, it's been documented in some detail that a majority, possibly up to 80%, failed to capture the original benefits and ambitions that people had for them. And why is that? I think there are broadly three common reasons, but I'd be interested to get the audience's perspectives in the Q&A later. I think, first of all, that often with AI, it's seen as a technology issue. It's not seen as a business strategy issue. And that is a common cause of failure. So really, to be successful, an AI transformation has to be driven by the business and by the strategy of the business rather than the focus being on the tech. Second, I think often the operating model of the organization and the culture of the organization doesn't always align with the strategy. They don't support each other. And particularly, we'll come on to the nature of the change being very largely around people, processes, culture, more than just tech or data around AI. And then third, often there are just too many initiatives relating to AI, use cases mushrooming all over the organization, and they take too long, and they don't bear fruit fast enough to capture the imagination of the people working in the organization. So those are the three most common causes I see as to why AI transformations often don't succeed.
Yeah, brilliant. And that's a really good outline, because broadly speaking, over the next sort of 40 minutes, that's the structure we're going to follow. We're going to talk about all of those things in a little bit more detail. But as Richard said, equally, if anyone's got anything else to add to that they've seen or they've heard, please do pop it in the comments or the questions, and we can cover it later. So yeah, let's talk about those three things then, Richard. So I think you've referred to it off air as the sort of the three waves of AI transformation. So the first one is a change of strategy, and you sort of touched on it there, which is I guess at the embryonic stage, it's kind of change of thought process, that this is not a technology problem and it's got to be a business strategy thing. So let's I guess, can you kind of unpack that a little bit more for us, how businesses can change that, or change that strategy?
Sure. I guess any strategy would tend to start with why. Why change is usually something that any of us in our individual or professional lives suffer through something that is an imperative rather than just happening as a matter of course. And generally, I think transformations are powered more by threats than opportunities. AI is a huge opportunity for almost every kind of business. We can talk about the nature of that opportunity if it would be helpful. But I think the motive force behind organizational change tends to be more the risk of loss and the promise of gain. And that risk is pretty material. Many of the folks on the call will have seen that there is an increasing turnover of companies. The life expectancy of companies has fallen pretty sharply. So about 40% of today's leading businesses face extinction in the next decade, and that's because the average lifespan, certainly in the S&P 500 and more generally, has dropped from about 60 years in the 1960s, steadily down to 20 years in 2020. And so that enormous drop has been driven by a few different things, but very significantly by technological disruption. And that provides a pretty compelling argument for reevaluating the way in which the business is put together and the way in which AI can drive advantage, rather than just focusing on the upsides and the benefits. It's that existential. In the public sector, it's a bit different. Actually, it's a bit more complex. Competition doesn't operate in the same way, but costs and expectations are rising faster than funding, and many aspects of public services will gradually decline and lose the confidence of citizens and the pride of staff without transformation. So I would say, starting with why transform is a good place, and often from threat rather than just for advantage.
Yeah, very good. And let's pick up on a few of the things that you've said there, because there's some interesting concepts, I think, in what you've said there. The first is, you said a line that 40% of businesses face extinction in the next decade, and some people might be surprised at that, but to me that's no surprise, because anecdotally speaking to senior business leaders and C-suite within large corporates, you will hear, it might be off the record, but you will hear the same types of things anecdotally. And I think that's because, you'll know better than me, but I think that's because large businesses face more competition, or competition coming from lots of different areas and businesses that maybe 5 years ago they didn't consider competition. So their kind of lunch is often getting eaten from all sides. But I mean, what would you say to people that might sort of I don't know, doubt that statistic?
I mean, there's quite a lot of published work out there that shows just arithmetically the decline in the longevity of the average company, and for people that believe that theirs is an exception and there is no imminent danger, the number of sectors that have been upended even in the last 12 months by Gen AI might be a cautionary tale to complacency. I think that it isn't just AI and technology. We've seen globalization as a huge driver of change. Increasingly, the shorter term focus of companies on things like quarterly earnings make it harder to focus on like longer term change, mergers and acquisitions, and so on. But the action in technology is often being driven by very large hyperscale firms, or culturally by small startups. And so the majority of the FTSE 100 or the S&P 500 are firms that no longer have leadership in a cultural sense for technology. And so it's something that is an opportunity, but is also a threat.
Yeah, absolutely. And you, I guess let's talk about the opportunity rather than something positive. And maybe we should have started this to set out the opportunity. I guess to put a positive slant on it for organisations, what is the opportunity with AI, and why is this not just a fad?
Well, I think that there's been a huge amount written on this. Most people will have seen in the popular press as well as business literature the amount of benefit and value that can come from AI, and that's both in an organizational sense, but also in just the lives of people. Just something more personal, BCG, that company that I'm with, is often thought of as a very high performance culture, something, an organization that is innovative and has highly skilled workers, and we do. But we've seen in the last 12 months a really quite a significant change with the use of Gen AI tools and the ability for individual members of staff to no longer have so much of the drudgery and the work of researching painstakingly facts and context online, or constructing images and articles. It has been a much faster process using tools like ChatGPT or Anthropic's Claude or other Gen AI tools. And so there's huge opportunities here. And from an operational business perspective, we have seen the more mature companies, both digitally native and the traditional companies that have adopted AI in a thoroughgoing way, grow much faster and certainly weather the storms as far as getting cost out of their business also much more successfully.
Yeah, absolutely, and I think that's right. I think we're beyond the hype already with AI, and organisations are already creating a huge amount of value from it. The other sort of concept that you spoke about a minute ago, and we chatted a bit about this off air, which was the concept of never wasting a crisis in terms of transformation. And this was a sort of light bulb moment for me, because I've always sort of the concept, well, things should be planned very meticulously and all this kind of thing. But I think your sort of view on it was actually a crisis can be a great thing for transformation, because it's a kind of an enabler of change and gets people moving in the right direction. So yeah, unpack that a little more for us.
Absolutely. I think crises in general, I think the Greek word, the root of crisis is actually change. And crises are generally enormously clarifying for priorities in one. You take COVID, the amount of change that many organizations, including in the public sector, saw in that 24-month period dwarfs perhaps the previous decade. And so it is a real opportunity. And it's something that not only can focus people on the existential quality of the need for change, but also can allow the input of resources that often are much stickier to move in peacetime. It sometimes takes wartime leaders to lead through crises, but also transformations.
Yeah. Yeah, so I guess the message is for people out there: don't worry, if embrace the crisis, and as you say, never waste a crisis. And I guess just finally on this topic, how do you, if you're someone, I don't know, who's a head of transformation within an organization, or someone responsible for AI transformation, what are the best ways in going about changing the mindset from technology to a business strategy?
It's a great question, and I think the first thing is to try and articulate the opportunity for artificial intelligence within the organization, for often data and digital services more generally, around the business strategy, not around the novelty or around the activity of competitors or anything else, but around how technology and AI in particular can enable the achievement of the business strategy. So it might be, for example, look at Octopus Energy recently and their use of Gen AI in call centers. One of their core pillars of business strategy is customer satisfaction and the associated operating costs with those functions. And Gen AI allowed a step change in both of those, generally resulting in higher levels of customer satisfaction, where people were interacting with the chatbot for the first time. I might add, chatbots have been famously a bit of a disaster zone for customer satisfaction, certainly my own satisfaction when engaging with them. But Gen AI allows a step change both in the experience of consumers and in the operating costs. And so hitching technology to those benefits, and often it will be something at the core of a business. Quite often boards, particularly outside a crisis, they're very keen to see experimentation, innovation, but that often happens at the periphery of organizations rather than at the center, on the mission critical heart of the business. And I would generally encourage leaders of transformation within a firm to capture the imagination of the core leaders of the business and the board around the raison d'etre for the organization, rather than making it something ancillary.
Yeah, great advice. We could probably talk about this topic for much longer, but for time, we've got to move on to what you refer to as the second wave of AI transformation, which is changing the operating model. So yeah, unpack this a little more for us, and how can organizations or how and why organizations should think about changing their operating model to leverage these new technologies.
Sure. Well, I mean, operating models have many different components. There's organizational structure, there's funding and cost allocation, ways of working, talent attraction and retention, and so on. But I've seen three particular ways in which AI-enabled firms, AI-transformed firms, perhaps systematically operate a little differently from other firms. And this is actually agnostic of the particular industry that they're working in. First of all, I see a shift away from large programs and specific projects towards a more mission-oriented organization, something that is associated with services rather than projects, and missions rather than programs. It tends to carry stable teams with predictable costs over time, rather than having programs that start and stop. And that's because a lot of these capabilities really do accrete over time. It isn't like building a bridge that has a beginning and middle and end. It is building an organization, and that's something that tends to require a longer run, but also accumulates over time as benefits. So that would be the first thing. The second thing would be, everybody will be familiar with a traditional line of business organization, perhaps with some functional elements running across the organization, HR, legal, IT, and so on. In AI-enabled organizations, I tend to see a much more devolved set of service teams on a very common technology platform, so that the data, the ability to start and deploy new services is much faster and less siloed across different lines of business in an organization. Often, particularly in operationally heavy firms, one of the advantages in AI is joining up decision making across those silos, and so the pyramid of these firms tends to be fatter and flatter as an organizational design and structure. And then maybe the last systematic difference I see is that traditionally we have a separation between build and run. And we have a team or a division focused on the new thing, initiation, starting it, and then we have a bunch of teams focused on continuation, sustainment. Yeah, partly because of the pace and continuous nature of change and evolution with technologies like AI, with digital services as well. We tend to see generally teams that build services to go on to run them. You don't sort of throw them over the wall to another part of the organization. So no more separation between build and run would be a third difference in operating model that I see.
Yeah, that's interesting. I think we've had a question come through that's actually on that topic. So yeah, maybe we'll cover that at the end. That'll be good. So no more separation from build and run. Okay. Well, let's just to pick up on a few things there, though. And I guess there's an overarching sort of Luddite comment on some of those things from myself. They all sound absolutely fantastic things that organizations should be doing. But in terms of like moving away from siloed verticals to a flatter and fatter structure, and services rather than projects and programs, how do you take a business with you on that kind of transformation, though? Because a lot of those changes are going to be like pretty fundamental changes in legacy businesses. So, you know, at a high level, how do you drag people with you who might be resistant to that kind of change?
100%. And this gets at the heart of why transformations are so difficult, because actually making those shifts involves both empowering but also disenfranchising different parts of the organization, funding this and not that. If you want to look at an organization's ambitions, look at their budgets rather than just their annual reports. Where are they allocating cash? And that's why the comment at the start around both the value of the threat, the value of crises is so important, because often it does require a pretty significant external force to generate the momentum Now that can be an incoming chief exec, a new board with a clear-eyed vision and a determination to do things differently. But often it has to come from the imperative from the outside to change. Otherwise, it's just too difficult. And I know this from my own life, making of New Year's resolutions, the finest of intentions, and by about January the 15th, it's the status quo ante again. So that's we are all constitutionally opposed to change. Even those of us responsible for leading it, and therefore it does require force to change rather than just gentle persuasion and the encouragement about the benefits.
Yeah, and I'm really. I know we've sort of the second time we've come back to this point, but I'm actually really glad that we've touched on it, because it does seem like a hugely important point. I often get asked in my job all the time, well, what are the things I should look at when joining an organisation? Because often executives, I think, get frustrated by their inability to transform and change an organisation, and actually, therefore, I think this is a really important point. Whereas a lot of people traditionally might have sort of been scared off by a business that's in crisis, or that's there is an imperative. I think actually probably the lesson here is use that actually as maybe a guide stick. Businesses that are in a bit of crisis and there is an imperative, you are more likely to be able to achieve that transformation and drag people with you. So as you say, never waste a crisis. Is that an old line from politics? I think you were telling me offline. Is that right?
I'm sure it is. I think Rahm Emanuel, Obama's advisor before he went to be mayor of Chicago, I'm sure said it, but he's unlikely to be the first.
Yeah, that's true. Right, here we go. So here we go. Never waste a crisis, people. This seems like probably a good segue into the third wave of AI transformation, unless there's anything else that you want to mention on operating model.
I mean, let's pick it up in questions. I think people may want to dive into things like talent and recruitment, or if people have experienced transformations just taking forever, an eternity to build a tech platform or the migration to cloud that might power the AI future. Happy to go into more detail there, but no, let's use that in questions.
Yeah, great. Well, let's move on to the what you've described as the third wave of AI transformation, then, which is change of culture. So, what for AI-enabled organisations and ones that have been successful, unpack that for us. How should you change culture? How should you imbue that culture into the organisation?
Well, BCG's written quite a lot about cultural change in general, and in particular, the phrase that it's context that drives culture, as opposed to being a mindset or values. It is usually the leaders, the stories they tell, what they spend their attention on, the structures, who reports to whom, and budgets and funding, the systems, how is performance management done, the incentives, structure of compensation, and so on. And it's those things that drive behaviors, and the behaviors then drive the mindsets and the feelings and the values of the organization. And so that's the causal direction, and so perhaps AI gets talked about quite a lot, but that's why culture matters so much, because it will determine the success of an AI transformation quite significantly, and particularly maybe three aspects. One, it's going to be harder to attract and retain tech talent unless you have technologists in leadership positions. I don't just mean CIOs or CDOs, but if you look at the tech giants or even most tech startups, it's the leaders of the businesses that are technically savvy, rather than just being the functional leaders. I don't know who the CIO of Google is, but the leaders of the business are the ones that are projecting the integration between technology and strategy for the firm. Second, I think it's harder to get benefit from operating model innovations like Agile if the executive leadership of the firm isn't willing to devolve decision makings to the team. It's easy to make changes to the operating model that look like theatre, ceremonies of varying sorts, but actually the benefits of a lot of these changes come from faster decision making and empowering that at a local level. And so it does require a change in context around the devolution of responsibility, for example. And then thirdly, and I don't think this gets focused on enough, AI transformations are, to a significant degree, powered by data. They may be directed by strategy, but the supply of and access to data within the firm is often overlooked. People talk a lot about how they can use data, but much less around what are the incentives to actually supply data. Who are the owners of those key data sources, registers? What are their motivations and incentives to collaborate, cooperate? I've seen this in most large companies and public sector organizations, this disconnect between who's using the data and who's supplying the data. And lots of focus comes on what are we going to use data for? How's it going to be driving value? What's the next exciting application and use case? Much less on the data architecture and incentives and structures that enable that to go through. You may remember Jeff Bezos. I think around 2002 in Amazon issued.
I think we lost you there, Richard. You back?
I am back.
We're back. Well, we're live. We're live, everyone, and this is the beauty of being live. things can go wrong.
A glitch in a machine. Where did we get to? I was chatting away.
Well, no, I think we were talking about the sort of the people who supply data and people who use data are often different in organisations, and that disconnect is a problem.
It is, just because often, unless the appropriate incentives are in place for people to share data, to supply data, it's not going to happen. It's not just going to happen through exhortation. And so both technologically, Jeff Bezos famously in 2002 insisted on APIs to connect data sources and applications together. A CEO doing that, even in 2023, in the FTSE 100, would be seen as unusual, and yet was formative in how quickly Amazon can move to create and power new services with data, including AI powered services, and not just technologically, but structurally. Who bears the risk? Who will be held responsible for inappropriate uses of data, for sharing without the appropriate legal and ethical guidelines? And if that's just the data supplier and the user of the teams using the data get all the credit, it's very asymmetric and it's unlikely to be successful. And so, the supply of data would be another cultural thing that often impedes the pace of transformation.
And how, in terms of incentives, how do you incentivize teams to share more data?
Well, they can range from the soft to the hard. At one extreme, you look at businesses that are literally selling data and making service and product offerings on the back of data sets, and they are incentivized by the revenue that they will earn from that, and you can mirror that internally. Data marketplaces are things that we have created for larger firms, where the complexity of structures means that having a sort of a forum, a marketplace to access data, and having some actual recharging or funding element to that is what powers the incentives and motives to share. On the softer element, both praise and blame can be used to encourage people to share more generally. I mean, Bezos in the memo that I referenced was perhaps a little bigger on the blame, and said that anybody not sharing data through APIs will be fired. Now, a variety of approaches there, but it has to be relatively determined and focused, rather than just writing this in a strategy that it ought to happen.
Yeah, absolutely. And I've said for years, I've sort of made this point that Amazon are the most data-driven business in the world, but they don't have a chief data officer. And then people often reply to me, well, Bezos is the chief data officer or chief data officer, and that's absolutely right. So it's probably a lesson for a lot of corporate CEOs, I guess, that this change, I think, has to be driven from the top. And I guess to sum up in terms of change of culture, then you sort of mentioned three overarching themes. One is devolved decision making. Two is supply and access to data in the firm is critical. And then finally, tech talent or a lot of top leadership roles need to be filled by technical expertise, perhaps more so than in the past. And I definitely echo that in my job. And actually, shameless plug, but next month or in 2 weeks, actually, our guest is James Bryce, who's head of talent and workforce planning at Virgin Media O2, who over the last 12 months or so has been through that exact the exact process. So stay tuned for that in a couple of weeks, everyone. Thanks for that, Richard, in terms of change of culture. That's really interesting stuff. Again, I feel we could talk about that specific point for hours, but we must move on. And we're going to come back to now something I referenced at the start. We're going to talk about examples of companies transformed with AI. And I think Roberto has actually asked a question along those lines. So I'm going to bring that up. Which segues us nicely into this part of the show. Roberto asks, are there any AI-enabled organizations? So keep your questions coming, everyone, by the way, because we're going to answer more at the end. But yeah, Richard, are there any AI-enabled organizations, or is this pie in the
sky? There are a bunch, and I think that they broadly would fall into two categories. The first is organizations that you might imagine to be pretty AI enabled, and in particular the hyperscalers. Google has and Meta and others have made great play around turning themselves into AI enabled organizations, and the hyperbole could scarcely be more dramatic, with Sundar Pichai claiming that AI is as important as the creation of fire, I think. So there's a focus there, and also focused in a whole raft of tech startups. Those you might imagine being AI enabled, certainly well on their way to being, if not out of the box. The second group are more traditional businesses that have become AI enabled over time. And I hope not to make them blush, but I would hold organizations like KLM, Royal Dutch Airlines, H&M, the clothing retailer, John Deere, a tractor manufacturer. You scarcely get more traditional, and yet they're basically running computers on wheels, and they've used AI associated with precision agriculture in a pretty thoroughgoing way. And so there are an increasing number of more traditional organizations. And I guess I'm very happy, if it's helpful, to give a couple of illustrations of those organizations in a bit more detail. Maybe one public sector, one private sector, if
right.
That's helpful, Jeremy.
Yeah, fantastic.
Okay, well, just take a public sector one and a pretty polarizing public sector example. The Home Office. I was responsible for digital data transformation in the Home Office a few years ago now, but the particular illustration of being AI enabled here related to passports. So people may remember that in the summer of 2014, there were enormous queues around the block that made it onto the 10 o'clock news, and people were worried about not getting their passport in time for their summer holiday. And that operational crisis, on top of all of the cuts that we saw after 2008, 2010, around a 30% cut in budgets meant that suddenly there was an enormous willingness to consider new ways of trying to address this kind of operational challenge. And there, over the space of about 18 months, the Home Office became very AI enabled for the use of that technology in the triage of passport applications that massively speeded up processing times and also allowed a more effective system for spotting fraudulent applications and finally made the workload of all of the case officers dealing with passports more interesting, because most people wanted to find the fraudsters, the criminals applying for passports, rather than just processing the extremely low risk applications. And so that is an illustration that there are many details underpinning it around how even a traditional organization, and one often seen as rather antipathetic towards technology, managed to embrace AI, machine learning, to reform a pretty fundamental operational part of the process. So that's the public sector example, and I guess the private sector one from a European train operating company. And here the challenge was that the service reliability wasn't quite up to the standards that people were expecting, both within the firm and within the government, the regulator for that service. And there were chronic challenges with workforce as well, with the recruitment of drivers and guards. And underpinning this was a challenge of a relatively siloed set of operational decisions being made. The way in which plans were made for which trains should run on which lines were often done months and months in advance and weren't adaptable to changes in conditions or the availability of staff. The decisions relating to maintenance and which trains got maintained when and where were unconnected with the kind of day-to-day operational pressures for breakages happening or disruption on the line caused by weather or other events, and that sort of day-to-day dispatch was also unconnected with crewing of the trains. And so they have systematically built a suite of AI optimization tools that has resulted not just in better tooling and decision making, but actually a much more joined up set of decision making driven by ultimately the chief operating officer across the firm, across those typical organizational silos. And again, rail is a relatively conservative industry, and we have seen how radical change can be driven using AI as a catalyst. So those are a couple of examples. Happy to go into more details, but don't want to bang on for too long.
No, not at all. I mean, I think, as I say, we could talk about this for hours, but time dictates, unfortunately. But I think, are both wonderful examples, and I guess that they sort of both are back to our almost overarching theme of this, which they both sort of have been driven by crisis to some extent and business imperative. So I guess we keep coming back to this theme. And I guess if a firm that builds tractors and runs railways can become AI enabled, no one's got any excuses out there. So we're up against it for time, so we're going to have to move on to questions now. So anyone who hasn't asked any questions and wants to get them in, please get them in now. Let's start with Satinder asks, so who in the C-suite do you see should be the accountable exec to drive change? You just mentioned the COO within the European train operator, Richard. Would you say the COO, or is it context dependent?
I think that probably I'd interpret it, change in two senses. The kind of change around the creation of new services, new tools, I would want to be driven by the owner of that particular line of business, either the board member or the business director responsible. But really, when it comes to the change of the organization, there's no escaping the responsibility of the chief exec, ultimately. And if they feel responsible, then change has a much, much higher chance of success, rather than their sense of just outsourcing the responsibility for change to a chief transformation officer or a chief digital officer or someone else. So the responsibility and the accountability, I think, should sit at a very senior and empowered level that can be devolved appropriately through the organization for the execution of it. But yeah, that's how I would see the responsibility sitting.
Yeah, great, fantastic. I've been in the comments. Lisa Raybone has informed us that it was Winston Churchill who is attributed to the quote, "Never waste a crisis." So there you go. We've got a question here from Kartik. One comment from my experience: no matter how efficiently you embed AI into business strategy, when the teams working on AI fail to understand how to operationalize an AI system, it leads to failure very quickly. Does that sort of hark back to your point about the team building need to be the team running?
Yeah, it does a bit, and I think as well as that point, it speaks to the broader imperative to integrate teams between tech and business together, multidisciplinary agile teams in the lingo. And that means that previously assumptions that you can design it all on paper and then sort of light the blue touch paper and 6 months later the tool is ready to deploy with a bang can be thrown away, and actually it's a much more iterative, integrated process of design, build and operate. It has to be teams working on AI that are unified between subject matter experts, business leaders, and technologists, rather than it being a sort of separate set of silos.
Yeah. Okay. Fantastic. Tom Sharp asks, how do you sway execs around tech given the noise and amount of options they have?
Well, I think in some regards their skepticism is reasonable and justified. I don't know, how many years we've read articles saying X or Y is the next big thing, and we have still got blockchain and Internet of Things and big data from a few years ago. So I've got a lot of sympathy with their skepticism, but I think the best way to sway execs is to demonstrate how the potential of tech directly bears upon their business objectives, and to do that with examples ideally from other firms in an analogous position, either in a different geography or the same industry, somewhere else. So that's how I would persuade execs. And second, to persuade them that change is possible, that it isn't just that it is valuable, but also that we can get there, and ideally that you can introduce them to people who can testify to that, rather than it just being your own encouragements. Certainly, the least well-placed person to try and persuade executives about the importance of change is someone like the director of transformation, because they've got a very strong vested interest in that being the right answer. So look for other sources of authority and persuasion to get business execs on side.
Yeah, good. So keep it specific and use examples from other firms, ideally. Where are we? Adil asks, is there an optimum size of firm which AI deployment may not make technically or financially feasible, i.e. lack of data, cost, benefit? That's a good question.
Yeah, it's obviously quite dependent on the size of the organization and the state of maturity, but a common failure I see is to pick use cases with a pretty limited scope for impacting overall organizational strategies. So I would say perhaps any size of firm can deploy AI. The ability to have an in-house team and recruiting those, it doesn't actually vary that much by size. It's just the size of the team will vary. But I'd say the error is often, regardless of the size of firm, to focus on the deployment of AI in use cases that are too small, rather than properly transformative and having that larger potential.
Yeah,
Adil, please come back if you've got follow-ups on that. But that's what I would say. I do see tech startups of a woman and her dog, all the way up to giant enterprises deploying AI. So it's not specific to the size of firm.
Yeah. And I think we're going to have to finish on this question. And apologies, there are other questions we've had, but we are running up against it for time. And it's from an anonymous LinkedIn user. It'd be great to get your vision on the AI ethics aspect of this kind of transformation.
Well, AI ethics is vital, but what I would say is that the most important aspect of AI ethics is not the sort of corporate rigmarole of producing principles and guidelines. It's actually what happens. So what are you eager and willing to communicate to customers, suppliers, staff about how you're using AI, and how are the AI systems being tested, being trained, and how can you ensure that the tools being used to do those are able to give assurance around governance. So quite a lot of AI governance and AI ethics operates at the level of GDPR and data protection. You should not do things that are bad, but that rarely has sufficient definition to influence the data science teams who are actually building software, and it rarely has the operational usefulness and to say, well, is my model biased? Is it fragile? Is it going to break in a critical situation? So those are the things I would focus on. Where does your data come from? How have you got confidence in its legitimacy and accuracy? Those kind of questions require tools and quite specific operational procedures rather than just high-level statements of strategy and intent.
Yeah, no, great answer. And we're coming to the end now, sadly. But to finish, Richard, I thought we'd finish by we've covered a lot here, and thank you so much for all your insights. I hope everyone's found it valuable. But if you are a business leader or transformation exec or CEO, if you had to, who's thinking about AI transformation, what would your sort of number one thing, your top tip be for them to take away, if nothing else, from this session?
Well, I've really enjoyed the chance to be with you, and very happy to continue the conversation with anyone that would like to through LinkedIn or YouTube or wherever you're watching this. The top tip I would have is to root your AI transformation in a business imperative rather than just in the excitement or the possibilities of a new technology. Rooted in something that the business must do, and that's I hope good advice for any business of any scale or particular industry.
Yeah, brilliant. And I think that's a great way to finish, and a great takeaway from this session. Richard, thank you again so much for joining us today, and all these insights. If people do want to continue the conversation with you, is LinkedIn the best way of getting in touch with you?
Yes, that'd be great.
Fantastic. So that just leaves, let me plug our episode in 2 weeks we've got coming up, which is around talent strategy and workforce planning in AI transformations. And our guest is going to be James Bryce, who's head of workforce planning at Virgin Media in O2. And we're probably going to do a deep dive into some of the aspects. I think Richard touched on them earlier around sort of talent strategy of an AI transformation. James is someone that's been through that and done it, and we're going to really get into the weeds around that from a talent perspective and what businesses need to do. So join us in 2 weeks for that. Outside of that, yeah, thank you again, Richard, and thanks everyone else for joining us, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you.
Bye bye.